failure, humiliation, death. That's what Vladimir Putin faces if Ukraine's counteroffensive is successful. Right now, Putin's propaganda machine is working overtime to manipulate the Russian public's perception of the war. The Kremlin is pumping out disinformation that the Ukrainian offensive is being crushed, the Russian economy is strong, and that troop morale has never been higher. All of these things are lies. But Putin needs to convincingly paint this picture of himself and the state of Russian affairs, because if he doesn't and the Ukrainian counteroffensive succeeds, it will be the end of his life. Vladimir Putin is scared, and he should be, because the Ukrainian military has superior training, weaponry, and vehicles when compared to his conscript army that is currently mounting a defense of the Zaporizhia Oblast region of Ukraine. Over the winter and spring months, Russia's been digging trenches and constructing fortifications along the 621 miles or 1,000-kilometer front line in preparation for this very moment. Ukraine has begun its offensive. But unlike what Russia did at the beginning of the war, its military leadership is taking calculated risks and relying on reconnaissance and intel to make informed decisions. When Russia launched its invasion, Putin ordered a full-on attack with massive amounts of tanks, artillery, and troops. Since you're watching this video right now, Russia's plans to overwhelm Ukraine's forces and to be welcomed into the country by the Ukrainian people obviously failed. Instead, the Kremlin's hasty attack and outdated tactics led to Ukrainian forces destroying and capturing over 2,001 tanks since the beginning of the war. Over 500 of those tanks were captured and repurposed by the Ukrainians, which meant while Russia's tank numbers were dwindling, Ukraine's were growing. These numbers have been supplemented by the delivery of 21 Leopard 2 tanks from Germany, with more modern tanks on their way. Instead of using the Russian tactic of throwing everything they've got at an enemy with no real plan of attack and hoping for the best, Ukraine is falling back on its NATO training and continued success of designing well-planned operations with a flexible command structure to maximize their smaller numbers. In terms of the counteroffensive, Ukrainian forces have been probing Russian defenses in order to locate weak spots that can be exploited. Ukrainian forces are using UAVs to gather intel and falling back on their knowledge of the landscape to identify areas where they can break through enemy lines. It's only a matter of time before the Russians either make a mistake or leave an area unguarded, at which point Ukrainian tanks and troops will plow through their defenses. When this happens, Putin will be in big trouble. He's managed to keep the Russian people in the dark by controlling the media within his borders. Putin already ordered the conscription of around 250,000 men in 2022 and another 147,000 men in the spring of 2023. And if Russia needs to initiate another round of conscription to replenish the number of soldiers lost during the Ukrainian offensive, it's going to make Putin look really bad. There's also the fact that the Kremlin will need to explain away how the Ukrainians got past their supposedly impenetrable defenses and continue to punish the Russian military. However, there is one aspect of the offensive that could be the final nail in the coffin for Vladimir Putin, and this is what he is most afraid of. We're going to lay out each aspect that Putin is shaking in his boots for shortly. But first, let's look at what type of defense Russia has created and what is actually standing in the way of the Ukrainian victory and Putin's demise. Russia has deployed minefields, concrete tank obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth, artillery impact zones, and trenches across southern Ukraine. The problem that the Ukrainian offensive faces is that Russia has had time to create a multi-layered defense structure that consists of static defenses, motorized rifle battalions, and artillery. Each battalion is responsible for an area approximately 3 to 5 kilometers wide and 2 to 2.5 kilometers deep. This works out to be around 4 square miles. For the past several weeks, Ukrainian artillery and missiles have been striking targets far behind the front lines to disrupt the Russian command structure and logistical capabilities. Simultaneously, Ukrainian ground forces are conducting reconnaissance missions with small groups of armored vehicles and tanks to locate entry points through the Russian defenses. This has resulted in the loss of around 16 armored vehicles and 1 Leopard 2 tank. But these are calculated risks that provide the Ukrainian military leaders with vital information that can be used when a full-on offensive is launched. The Russian defenses are set up in 4 stages in most areas, with deep trenches and ditches dug first to slow Ukrainian tanks and vehicles down, followed by concrete Dragon's Teeth. Beyond these first 2 defenses are infantry trenches where Russian soldiers with anti-tank weapons and rocket-propelled grenades wait. The final defense is another trench where Russian commanders are located. This final series of trenches can also be used for Russian soldiers to fall back to in case they need to retreat. The goal of these defenses isn't necessarily to stop Ukrainian forces, but to slow them down. This is because they become easy targets for the Russian artillery located much further away from the front lines. This could decimate an entire Ukrainian force, which is why they're spending time conducting reconnaissance missions to identify the best locations to cross through Russian defenses. This means that Putin is anxiously waiting for what comes next. He is watching closely, as he's likely fully aware that the Russian defenses are full of vulnerabilities. It's been found that many of the defensive features in Ukraine were dug and built by contractors who had little to no military engineering experience. This lack of expertise has led to fortifications that are inadequate for repelling modern Western tanks and well-trained Ukrainian soldiers. Recent photos have shown that some of Russia's Dragon's Teeth have been improperly set up, likely due to the lack of training or military knowledge of the contractors. Dragon's Teeth should be connected to one another underground and also partially buried. Instead, some of these features are just sitting on top of loosely packed dirt. Also, several strands of Dragon's Teeth have already begun falling apart due to environmental factors. This means that they likely won't be able to withstand the weight of tanks and armored vehicles when Ukrainian forces push forward. Knowing that there are clear weak points in Russia's defenses has Putin pulling his hair out. At least, he would if he had any. Instead, the Russian dictator is trying to brainstorm ways to spin the inadequacies of the Russian military to keep the general public on his side. But all the propaganda in the world will not save him if the Ukrainian offensive is successful, and the reasons why are pretty straightforward. Number 1. A successful Ukrainian offensive will highlight the inadequacies of the Russian military and Putin's rule. At this point in time, around 98% of combat vehicles and weapons promised to Ukraine have been delivered. Notably, dozens of modern tanks have still not made it to Ukraine but are on their way, such as around 80 Leopard 2s from European countries and 31 M1 Abrams from the US. However, with around 1,550 armored vehicles and approximately 230 tanks being delivered from Western nations, Ukraine has approximately 950 tanks and over 2,000 armored vehicles ready to launch their offensive. Ukrainian forces have also been receiving training from NATO on how to use the Leopard 2 tanks and offensive strategies since the beginning of the war. While this was happening, Russian conscripts received little to no training and instead were handed a gun, shipped to the front lines, and told to dig trenches during the brutal winter months in Ukraine. This not only means that the Russian troops defending the front lines have had little idea of what they're doing, they're also demoralized, resulting in a number of AWOL cases. In fact, the number of soldiers that went AWOL in the first 4 months of 2023 exceeded the total number of cases in 2022. This must make Putin nervous because he is quickly running out of reserves to replenish the number of men he has on the front lines. Putin's plan right now is to wage a war of attrition in the hopes that Russia's superior numbers and vast natural resources will allow his forces to last long enough for Western nations to lose interest in helping Ukraine. And to be fair, this wouldn't be the first time that NATO or the West started something that they didn't finish. In fact, this very scenario happened in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea, and the West condemned his actions but sat idly by while Ukraine's land was stolen. If Russia's defenses are deep enough and its superior numbers can hold out against the Ukrainian offensive, then Putin can continue his war of attrition for many years if need be. That being said, this plan will only work if the Ukrainian forces can be stopped, which is seeming more and more unlikely. And it's because of this fact that Putin is very afraid of what is to come in the summer months. Number 2. The Ukrainian offensive could erase everything that Russia has done since the beginning of the invasion, which would make Putin look weak. The offensive could signal the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. At the start of the war, most of the Russian people supported the invasion and reclaiming Ukraine as a Russian territory. However, this was when taking Ukraine seemed like an easy victory. Now that the war has continued into its second year with no end in sight, the Russian people are beginning to question Vladimir Putin's leadership. This is terrifying for the dictator, but things will only get worse if the Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful. To put how badly the war is going into perspective, it's estimated that around 475 days into the war in Ukraine, the Russian army has lost more than 178,000 soldiers. This is 12.7 times more than were lost in both Chechen wars, where Russia suffered 14,000 casualties. The number of men killed or wounded in Ukraine is also around 11.8 times more than the Soviet army lost in the 9 years of the war in Afghanistan, where they sustained approximately 15,000 casualties. If the offensive is successful, supply routes that run from Russia through eastern Ukraine will be lost. This will make resupplying Russian troops in southern Ukraine much more difficult, and as Russian soldiers become less well-equipped and demoralized, Ukrainian forces will gain more of an upper hand. This will lead to a snowball effect where Russian troops are pushed further and further south. Without the supply lines running through eastern Ukraine, Russia will have to commit more resources to airdropping equipment into southern Ukraine or taking the much longer route through Crimea. If Ukrainian forces break through the front line, encircle Russian soldiers, and force them to retreat further south, it'll also mean that Ukraine has reclaimed all of the land Russia invaded back in February of 2022. This does not include Crimea, which we'll talk about in a bit, but what this does mean is that the invasion would officially become a total failure. If Ukraine can push Russian forces all the way to the land bridge between Crimea and southern Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will have nothing to show for a year and a half of fighting. This will lead to the oligarchs, other prominent Russian leaders, and the general public to question Putin's rule. It'll be incredibly hard to spin the Ukrainian offensive as a failure if they reclaim all the territory Russia invaded, which is why Putin is terrified of what could happen in the coming months. However, most analysts suspect that Ukraine won't take back all of the territory in the Zaporizhia region right away, but at least will secure a large portion of the area. Even this could be enough to oust Putin, depending on how angry the Russian people and elites get at their loss of their countrymen in Putin's pointless war. Number 3. If the Ukrainian offensive is successful, it could threaten Russia's control over Crimea. This is Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare. Putin's biggest fear is losing Crimea. This is because he built and sold his dreams of a new Russian empire on the foundation of annexing Crimea in 2014. This event served as the backbone for everything that was to come and the invasion of the rest of Ukraine in 2022. What this means is if the Ukrainian offensive reaches Crimea, it would be a tragedy for Vladimir Putin. This is probably the one outcome of the offensive that Putin is most scared of. But the craziest part is that Ukraine doesn't even need to take Crimea during the offensive. All they need to do is get close, and Vladimir Putin's power will begin to dissolve. It should come as no surprise that the most alarming proposition for any dictator is appearing weak. To most of the world, Putin already looks weak. But if the Ukrainian counteroffensive pushes Russian forces all the way back to Crimea, the Russian president will be seen as weak by the Russian people. This is not something he can afford, and it could very well lead to the end of his time in power or even his life. During the winter months, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky declared, "Crimea is our land, our territory," to the world. This contradicts the rhetoric that Putin has spewed to the Russian people for years. Those words also likely instilled fear into Putin as it became clear that the Ukrainian offensive in the summer months could target the Crimean Peninsula. However, Ukraine doesn't need to take Crimea in order to hurt Putin. On top of losing all the land that Russia invaded, a successful offensive would allow Ukraine to blockade the Crimean Peninsula, a proposition that would slowly whittle away any remaining control Putin has over the region. There is no doubt that retaking Crimea by force would be incredibly costly for the Ukrainian military. Thousands of lives would be lost, and the infrastructure of the peninsula would be decimated. If Ukraine tries to take Crimea by force, there would likely be no clear winner. However, they don't necessarily have to launch a military campaign on the peninsula to hurt Putin. The narrow land bridge that connects Crimea to the rest of Ukraine serves as a choke point where artillery and Russian defenses could hold back pretty much anything Ukraine throws at them. But the same can be said about keeping Russian supplies and reinforcements out of Crimea as well. There are only two entry points into Crimea from the mainland. One is from southern Ukraine, the other is from western Russia. A successful offensive would allow Ukraine to cut off Russian access to Crimea from the Zaporizhia Oblast. To cut off supplies and military shipments being sent via the Black Sea or the Sea of Azov, Ukraine could use uncrewed surface vessels, or USVs, to intercept ships or attack them at Sevastopol. This would be done by packing a USV with explosives and sending it on a kamikaze mission to blow a hole in the hulls of Russian ships. This is a relatively simple and low-cost strategy that could result in serious disruptions to the Russian naval supply lines in Crimea. The USVs could also be used to lay mines at port entrances as another way to sever Russian supply routes. Basically, rather than losing Crimea to a Ukrainian attack, Putin has to worry about losing it to a Ukrainian siege. Ukraine has already attacked the Crimean bridge connecting Russia to Crimea at least once and caused massive damage. So after the offensive takes back the land across the Sea of Azov, launching future attacks on the bridge will be even easier. This means there would be virtually no way to get resources or troops to Crimea except by plane, and aircraft can only deliver a fraction of the supplies that ground vehicles and ships can. Also, if NATO ever sends Ukraine F-16s that they promised, it would pretty much be game over for Russia in Ukraine. The proposition of Crimea eventually falling or slowly crumbling due to a Ukrainian blockade must be eating away at Putin. Every day that passes where Ukrainian forces probe the front lines brings them that much closer to advancing toward Crimea. When this happens, Putin may suffer a heart attack from the stress of watching his dreams of a Russian empire slowly slip away as the Russian people and leadership begin to turn against him. To be clear, reaching Crimea even once the Ukrainian offensive gets going will not be easy. However, if things continue to go in the favor of Ukraine as they did just before the winter hiatus, Putin could be in big trouble. And as we mentioned before, losing Crimea is Putin's biggest fear. He'll do anything to prevent Ukraine from regaining control of Crimea, even if it means putting the entire world on the brink of all-out war. Because it's clear that if Crimea falls, Putin will fall too. Thus far, there hasn't been a serious push to penetrate the Russian line, but Putin, like the rest of the world, knows it's coming. This has probably led to a lot of sleepless nights and discussions about what to do if the Ukrainian offensive succeeds. When Ukrainian forces push through, Putin will be left with two options. The first is to negotiate some kind of peace. The problem is that Ukraine will not even entertain the idea of peace talks unless it involves Russia completely withdrawing from its territory, including Crimea. Since this isn't an option for Putin, due to the fact that he'd end up being ousted from power, it leaves option 2, escalation. If Putin sits idly by while the Ukrainian offensive drives his forces further and further back toward Crimea, it'll only be a matter of time until Ukraine is in a position to blockade the peninsula or gather more support from Western nations to take back the territory. Vladimir Putin knows he cannot allow this to happen, so his only option will be to escalate things in the hope that he can either stop Ukraine's advancement or have the international community step in and force Ukraine to come to the negotiating table. Unfortunately for Putin, the West is tired of cowering to Russia's escalation rhetoric and has shown through their support of Ukraine that they no longer fear Vladimir Putin. There are two ways that Putin could escalate the conflict. The first is by conscripting more Russians and throwing another wave of troops at Ukraine. The Wagner Group, made up of mercenaries for hire and former inmates, is already recruiting more men to their organization to help combat the Ukrainian offensive. UK military intelligence has recently reported that there are approximately 50,000 Wagner Group mercenaries in Ukraine at the moment. The conscription option would be done at a great cost to the Russian people. But Putin may hope that by throwing wave after wave of troops at Ukraine, he'll be able to wear them down and eventually claim victory. The other way Putin could escalate the conflict is by putting nuclear weapons back on the table. If Putin is backed into a corner and all of his worst fears come true, he may be willing to risk the safety of the planet in order to maintain power. Deploying nukes, either tactical or strategic, and threatening to use them may be enough to stop the Ukrainian offensive. However, NATO and the international community would come down hard on the Russian dictator if he chooses this option. In fact, even Russia's most powerful partner, China, would almost certainly not support Putin in his decision to use nukes. This option would literally turn much of the world against Russia, which would then result in Putin either being stripped of power or suffering from a mysterious set of deadly circumstances. The terrifying thing for the rest of the world is that if Ukraine's offensive is successful and Putin resorts to escalation with nukes, then nobody will win. But this is the crux of the problem. Putin's fear of the Ukrainian offensive is warranted because throughout the war, Ukraine has exceeded everyone's expectations. Ukraine successfully defended its capital from the initial invasion. They pushed Russian forces almost completely out of their territory, and they managed to come out victorious against a much larger army. These facts mean that the offensive will likely go well for Ukraine, which terrifies Putin. There are also around 600,000 Russian settlers in Crimea and Russian collaborators in the Donbass that would need to escape the incoming Ukrainian forces if they manage to break through the Russian defenses. It's unlikely that Putin would spare any men or resources to ensure that these people reach safety, which could mean that many Russians still in Ukraine may be facing angry Ukrainian soldiers on their own. If this happens, there could be an outcry from the Russian people, and a popular movement to remove Putin from power could arise. So, no matter what Vladimir Putin does, he'll find himself in a precarious position. His goal right now is to continue this war of attrition that Russia has been waging ever since its initial invasion failed. They cannot defeat the superior Ukrainian tactics and newly acquired equipment from the West. However, Russia still has a massive amount of men and resources at its disposal, since Vladimir Putin controls pretty much every industry and individual within Russia's borders. Using his reserves and conscripting more men might lead to an eventual ceasefire as Ukraine's forces get closer to Crimea, but don't have the manpower or resources to make the final push. This would give Putin the time to recruit more soldiers and dust off more ancient equipment from the early Soviet era. Left to his own devices, Putin will never stop throwing men at the war effort until he can enter negotiations that will favor him, or by some miracle, his forces manage to secure some kind of victory, prolonging the war even more. This could actually be the end goal for Vladimir Putin. He might be trying to wait everyone out until circumstances are in his favor, even though this doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon. Putin is now afraid that if the offensive pushes his forces further back, it'll be difficult to convince the elites and the public that there was any victory to be had at all, which is why he is vying for more time. What it comes down to is that Vladimir Putin is terrified of the Ukrainian offensive because a loss at this stage could be the final straw for the Russian people. The majority who wanted to seize Ukraine now only want peace. The Russian people are suffering, and they're beginning to blame Putin. During the offensive, we'll probably see Ukrainian forces push through Russian defenses and take back at least some of the land that Russia currently controls. This will not be the end of the war, but it could signal the end of Vladimir Putin. The dictator is currently hoping that by utilizing Russia's sheer numbers, he can prolong the war until the West loses interest or stops sending Ukraine support. At that point, he can probably negotiate a far more favorable outcome for himself. Russia has a population of around 3 times the size of Ukraine's, meaning that there are still hundreds of thousands of men who can be conscripted into military service. Putin isn't afraid to lose more men, but he is afraid that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will reach Crimea, and at that point, Putin's life would be put in jeopardy. Now watch ex-CIA agent breaks down why Putin is in trouble, or check out real reason Russia gave Crimea to Ukraine.